What is up, everybody? It is Alex from Heavy New York, calling from the quarantine zone again, and this time we are here with Dan of DVNE. Thank you so much for your time today, man. Great to have you here.
No worries at all. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So the new album, Etemen Ænka, coming out very, very soon. Do you just want to talk about how the making of this record was? Was there kind of like a preconceived idea? How did Etemen Ænka sort of like see the light of day?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it feels like quite a long time ago now. We actually recorded because the whole thing has been put back by a year. So we recorded this in summer 2019, so a couple of years back. But yeah, great recording session with Graham Young down at Chambers again. We were in there for what 6-7 weeks probably actually recording. The actual concept and everything we'd hashed out probably about a year or so before. So a lot of the songs have been being worked on for nearly 2 years on some of them. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we take a lot longer over some songs than other songs. And things like the lyrics, the concept of the album, everything like that, we had pretty much good to go before we went into the studio. Artwork as well. We'd spoken to Marold, who's done the sleeve for the album, which is awesome. And yeah, even that we had most of that artwork done before we actually hit the studio, which is a very nice sort of way to have the sort of idea of the concept down before actually putting the music down.
Awesome. Like, do you almost feel that because you said you were working on this now for 2 years, this material, is what we're hearing on this album, like how this was first initially made, or did these songs maybe change a lot over a span of time?
So, I mean, with everything getting put back, we had a bit of extra leeway with things like the mixing, stuff like that. I mean, the bass songs haven't really changed much since we put them down to track on, 2 summers ago now. But saying that, actually going into the studio, a lot of the tracks, probably only 78% actually finalized. A lot of the final little bits of guitar, a lot of the synth work, a lot of little bits of vocal patterns, things like that. We left a lot of room this time to basically just have a play around in the studio, which was really nice to do, and just having that extra sort of free time for a bit of creativity certainly helped on this one, we feel. But it's having a lot more time than say on a Sharon.
Yeah,
was a big factor on this one.
Do you feel that this is, because you mentioned that there is a concept for this album, do you almost feel like conceptually it is almost kind of like a follow-up to Asheron, or do you think that this is like maybe a new beginning for Dune in a way?
Yeah, so technically on a concept front, it's a prelude to a Sharon.
It's a prequel?
If we're going to get nerdy on the narrative. It's timeline-wise, in this whole sort of universe we've created around a Sharon and this album, this one sort of sits before. From an actual sort of music point of view, there's definitely newer elements in. There's 2 different members to when we did a Sharon, and we've added a synth player as a full-time member now as well. So musically, the concept on that's moved forward a little bit as well. I think there's a lot more depth to the tracks and just allow us to explore that sort of mad little world we've gone into.
So if people really wanted to get a good understanding of the narrative of Dune, they should actually listen to the new album first and then move on to Asheron.
Oh yeah, totally. Or it'll be, I don't know, maybe some people, it'll be like episode 1 or something. You never know what to tell people with that.
Yeah. Well, where does Progenitor stand in the catalog?
Oh, Progenitor is sort of outside. There's a couple of references to parts in things that happen in Progenitor, because you have to get those little cross references in for those who are really paying attention to the lyric sheet. But that one was written a bit more before we had our sort of the concept and our sort of shit together as a band as much. There's still a few. There's a couple of characters in that might return up at some point in the future.
Oh, wow. Do you try to leave like the concept of Dune almost open to interpretation, or do you actually try to maybe engage the listener into maybe seeing things from this narrative?
So, I mean, we've always, myself especially, I've always really liked giving people a little bit of leeway with how they're interpreting lyrics. Obviously, there is like a sort of set idea and a narrative behind stuff, but I love it when people can go away and sort of take their own ideas away from it. It was funny, there was a guy who actually wrote, I think for a Sharon, there was like he'd written like a multi-page blog essay going into the lyrics, and there were all these little things that he'd picked up and references that some of them were definitely in there, and other things were bits he'd said, oh, this must be an influence from, say, this book. And it was a book that I haven't read, and I find out about other things through this and pick up on other books through people. So that's, yeah, it's great. As I said, I think it's sort of like any good book, hopefully, in that it's sort of always a little bit open to interpretation. I don't like to go too down the line of telling people exactly what each line means, word by word sort of thing. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, like I was actually just interviewing the band I interviewed before you, Brand of Sacrifice. They kind of have like a narrative behind their albums, but like they say like, no, we would love it if listeners listen, like, you know, we're into the story and we're more than happy to explain to them, but you also don't want to shove the meaning down their throat. You kind of
exactly. So I mean, they've got all the artwork that alludes to what's going on. There's a couple of liner notes, things like this, but yeah, you definitely don't want to shove that down people's throats, as you say.
Yeah. Do you feel that the first single that you released off of the brand new album could almost serve sonically as a clear representation, or being that there's 10 songs on here that, like, you know, this is just the tip of the iceberg, as I like to say?
Yeah. I mean, Omega's definitely got a sort of bits of all the sort of elements on the album. I think that's why we sort of decided to drop that one first, because it's still got the sort of heaviness that a lot of the other tracks have, but then it's quite sort of expansive with I mean, I'm not sure everyone was expecting us to drop a track that for the first minute or so is just clean vocal. But we like to surprise people and change it up a bit as well. Yeah. But yeah, I'd say it's definitely, there was a good discussion about what we should drop first off the album, obviously, as you can imagine, between members. But yeah, it's definitely a good sort of catch-all of the sort of thing to expect.
Yeah. Well, you know, what's funny is I've always thought that, you know, your music was a little bit more on the experimental side. Like, Asherin is where I discovered Dune. That's
Great.
Where I first heard of you. And, like, you know, going from a song like the Crimson Path to Viridian Bloom to a track such as Thirst, I mean, there's already so many albums or elements demonstrated on there at once. So trying new things and experimenting with your style almost just has to be part of the songwriting process you're doing, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're always looking for something a little bit different to do, or a little bit of just a different approach. Again, going back to the fact this album, we've actually put all the synths in there full time now, whereas a Sharon we'd used a little bit on the recordings. They were sort of in there as bits of texture here and there, but we've actually gone like, let's try and use this now as a full instrument and see what sort of depth that's adding to bits. I grew up like listening to John Carpenter and watching The Thing and all this sort of stuff. So for me, synth's fantastic because I'm old. I love that sort of 80s weird vibe. And it sort of also fitted a little bit in with the sort of sci-fi vibe that we had going as well. So it's been this really nice sort of natural development of just adding a bit, something extra for this album for people. And I think that's always the approach we're going to take. I don't think we're ever going to be that happy just sticking to, we don't want to put the same album after album, basically. We want to give people something new or something a little bit different to think about with the music.
Yeah, and you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, because if you do put like a similar style out, people are going to say, oh, they're repetitive, it sounds like anything else they've done.
Exactly,
but
if you experiment with other bands.
Yeah, and if you experiment, they'll say you're all over the place. So you just got to go with the gut instinct.
For sure. I mean, at the end of the day, as long as we're putting stuff out that we're enjoying, and we're having a kick-ass time writing this stuff and playing it at the moment. Obviously, current situation besides the point. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we've always run it as we write the music for ourselves. We're very lucky in that a lot of other people seem to be into this and into what we're doing and what we're putting out.
Yeah. Do you feel like with the concept and the narrative that you try to convey in Dune's music that, like, is this maybe at all like a representation of you, or is it kind of like a metaphor for a personal experience, or is it coming from your own personal point of view, or do you feel like Dune is almost kind of like demonstrating completely outside of who you personally are?
I mean, I guess some of the sort of personal beliefs and things like that, they'll obviously slip in there. I mean, it's hard to write lyrics and not have obviously a bit of yourself or a bit of your own ideas and personality slip in there. We don't, because a lot of the lyrics sort of get written between myself and Victor as well. So there doesn't tend to be that much on the sort of very, very personal level with either of us. We tend to go down to more sort of, if it sounds cool and epic rather than if it's feelings. But yeah. I mean, it's but there's definitely sort of, even though it's obviously we're setting a lot of this narrative in a sort of make-believe sci-fi world, there's obviously some reflections on sort of modern society issues going on. I mean, Etemen talks about the sort of issues with technology, how they can help both bring up and stagnate society at the same time. So, I mean, there is sort of ideas behind stuff. But yeah, it doesn't tend to be so much on a as personal level as some other bands maybe go into. But yeah, it's definitely sort of shared influence between 2 or 3 of us in the band when it comes to writing.
Yeah. Do you, obviously, you know, when you have a concept, because, you know, I've always had an unhealthy obsession with concept albums, whether it's Fear Factory or Mastodon or any of those. But obviously, you know, a concept, when you have a concept, it determines the lyrics, obviously. But do you feel that it can also determine the music itself? Do you almost feel that, like, if this new album was almost like an instrumental album, it could also maybe convey that narrative?
I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of the time when we've gone to write lyrics, especially, we've usually got 80% of the guitars and drums written before we actually tackle the lyrics, before we sit down to finalize that sort of concept. So a lot of the time it's actually the music influencing the concept rather than the other way around. In the way we've been writing the last couple of albums, I mean, it's like changing future, as I was saying again, with always looking at changing how you do things album to album. So, for example, for Etemen, I think we had the majority of the idea of the songs, what order they're going to be in, and obviously what they sound like before we then finalise all the lyrics for them, which gives us sort of good basis because we almost set everything out and then we have sort of almost peaks and troughs of where a narrative can then sit within that album and within a sort of 60-minute piece of music. And I mean, there'll be things that I've penned down beforehand and whilst we're writing, but that final sort of come together of exactly sort of what's happening where on the album and in what context, that comes usually just as we're sort of going into the studio, finalising everything.
Mm-hmm. And you know, being that, and kind of going back to what you said with this new album, that you worked on it for a long period of time, and I don't know if this is even a goal for the songwriting process, but do you find that maybe the longer you work on something, the harder it is to kind of like capture a moment or maintain that emotional spark that initiated the songwriting?
Yeah, sometimes. As I say, there's some tracks we have that we'll spend 4 months writing and tweaking and just spend labouring over. And there's other tracks where we might just jam an idea out, go away, work on that for a day, come back, and it's done. There's not done because they're 9-10 minute songs usually. So there's always work to go in it. But yeah, definitely some of them come together a lot faster than others. Especially, I think once we get into that sort of crunch time of 3 months before we know we're going into a studio, we certainly up our game a lot when it comes to finalising things. But as I say, we've also done the important thing this time, I think, which is just to leave a bit of space for that in-studio creativity as well. But yeah, it's as I say, it changes song to song. We've had ones that have taken Victor maybe a day or so, and he's come back with a full song, and then other ones where we've maybe got 2 or 3 riffs, 2 or 3 minutes sorted, and I think there's ones we've dropped. We've been in the studio, I think, at Sharon at least. There was 1, maybe nearly 2 tracks that just didn't even make the cut because we'd gone in wanting them on there and then basically made the decision whilst recording that they basically weren't up to scratch. So there's quite a long process at times. But yeah, track to track, it tends to differ.
Yeah, and especially with the new album, like I noticed that like a song such as Towers is very different from a song like Court of the Matriarch, or a very different vibe from a song like Omega Severer, or Weighing of the Heart. Does your emotions or your personal experiences, even if this narrative is sort of like outside of who you personally are, there's no denying that your emotions still influence the songwriting process.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Yeah. I mean, especially, the heavier stuff is almost certainly getting written when one of us has had a bad day or or a meaner day. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's not that, as I was saying before, just about the personalization coming through the lyrics. There's definitely a lot of feeling and emotion sort of thing goes into writing the songs and everything. And yeah, as you say, things tend to change quite substantially between tracks, as you've noted, like Towers compared to, say, Courts is a very different track. But I think we try to keep that sort of overall sight of where the album is and how the tracks are sort of flowing and interacting, and hopefully that shows with this sort of latest release that even if the tracks are quite different, they still sort of work and seem to fit quite nicely.
Mm-hmm. Are you ready for the most difficult question of the whole interview?
Go for it.
How do you know when a song is done?
Oof. See, that's a tough one. So, I mean, Malmsteen gets mentioned in the studio a lot because of his "more is more" quote. And you heard this, so it's when Malmsteen was approached by a producer recording one of his many solos. The producer tried to tell him less is more, but Malmsteen's response was "more is more." And it's two sides of the same coin. I mean, there's points where we've spent whole afternoons adding layers and layers and layers that we've just stripped back. What's been very good for both Sharon and Etemen Ænka, Graham, who we're working with in the studio, is very, very good and helpful when it comes to that sort of needing an extra person in the room for a decision, or perhaps coming up with a different idea for something that we didn't have, or literally just going, no, stop adding stuff to this song. It's done. It sounds fine. Because obviously, when as a writer, when you're writing and you're in the studio, it can sometimes be very hard just to take that step back and just go, actually, this is fine. The way we've been playing it for the last 6 months is fine. We don't need to add anything else to this. But to know for sure, I don't think there's ever a unanimous decision 100% to start with when a track first gets down in the studio, when that track's finished.
Yeah. The best way to sum it up is when the least amount of people are unhappy.
Yeah. If you've got 4 out of 5 of you happy with the track, that's probably done.
Yeah, and you're not going to get any better than that anyway. So
No.
Yeah. And another question I have for you is actually for your style of playing, and really for just like, is there ever a time where maybe like classical music or like even like an element of theory is ever incorporated in your music? Because I do find the music very technically impressive.
Yeah, sure. So I myself, I'm not classically or even theoretically trained. I learned guitar, picking up old punk songs and learning how to play them. Whereas Victor very much grew up. Let me get this right. He was a trained harpsichordist from quite an early age. So he's done sort of classic theory, musical theory since quite an early age. So what it lends is quite a good mix, because we have both Victor, who's got that sort of grounding in classical stuff, and we both listen to those sort of things. And especially for this album, we've tried to listen to a bit more sort of Eastern influenced things. I've actually got I'll actually get out really, the old Turkish guitar sort of thing that we broke out for bringing into the studio. But yeah, I mean, it's lends itself quite well, because the things we come up with as guitarists sometimes tend to be quite different in our approach. Just as I say, because he has that more sort of classical sort of approach to stuff, his songwriting is very sort of strong, but then there's also lots of random little bits and little time changes and odds, because I grew up playing in loads of like death metal and grindcore bands, things like this. So there's lots of little bits that he wouldn't necessarily think of that we all do. But yeah, it's a good mix to have, I think. I think it keeps things quite fresh.
Yeah, and it definitely creates a lot of contrast, which I think is very prevalent in your music.
Yeah. I mean, even from, say, like the lead play, you can usually tell when it's me or it's Victor.
Yeah.
Because He's a better guitarist than I, to be fair. So.
Damn. So before we go, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Absolutely great, man.
Is there just anything else with Dune that you would like to promote for the release of the brand new album in terms of like, a live stream performance to hold people over or?
So we've got, I'm not sure when, obviously this is airing.
By midnight.
We've got another, all right, great. I'm not sure if it's actually out then for the next week or two, but we've got there's basically a live video that we shot again with Graham, who we recorded the album with. We shot a live video for the track Towers of the album in December. I'm actually just finishing off editing that together as we speak. So that should hopefully be dropping in, I'm not sure on the exact timescale, but what date are we on? It should be dropped, hopefully, I think by the end of this month, sort of midway between now and when the album's out. So there's one more track for you all to hopefully all be able to enjoy once I've finished putting that together. And yeah, apart from that, just album out on March 19th, and just really, really psyched to get it out there and see what people are thinking.
Yeah, and people definitely are going to enjoy it. So
cheers, man.
Thank you so much. Everybody, we are here with Dan of Dune. Be sure to check out the new album, Etemen Ænka, coming out via Metal Blade Records March 19th. This is Alex from Heavy New York. We will see you next time.